Walmart sells a t-shirt, and the t-shirt says, "Disability is not a bad word." I have one, my team has one, we wear them proudly. And one of the first things that we started doing when we launched the Accessibility Center of Excellence at Walmart was to help our executives understand why it's so important to actually say the word disability and to talk about what disability is, what disability means. And as we start to have those conversations, to also get comfortable talking about what ableism is and what ableism means and how all of that shows up in our communities, in our societies, and in our workplaces. So I'd like to just kick off by asking each of you, and Cara, we'll start with you, and then Keely, go to you, just to share with our audience what has been your own personal understanding of the word disability and how that has come to be experienced by you in the world and in society. So Cara.
Thank you. And it's an honor for myself, and I'm sure I speak for Keely, to be on the stage with Gayatri. To be invited to speak with her in any space is something I would fly anywhere in the world to do. But I spent the first 30 years of my life without a disability. And at the age of 30 was diagnosed with a chronic illness. I've been using a wheelchair for about 5 years, so about 17 years after that diagnosis. And when I'm zipping around, particularly in this chair, the sexy chair, not the big monstrosity that I use on a day-to-day in the rough streets of New York, without fail, a child will see me and point their little finger and on, ask the adult what's that? Can I ride that? Why does that lady use that? And the awe and the wonder of that child makes me really happy and excited to have a good conversation. But all of a sudden, the child will hush, shh, oh no, don't do that. Get out of the way, honey. That's not nice. Leave the poor lady alone. Poor lady? Now, this begs the question, these interactions. When is it in our social development that we start to associate difference with or difference with or these kinds of questions? And it tells me that it begins with our parents. Because not only is the parent telling the child that there's something wrong with their question, they're telling them that there's something wrong with me. And so I find that my experience with disability is one, having to take this leap of unlearning that I myself had the first 30 years growing up without a disability or being exposed directly to people with. But out in my life day to day, in my workplace, even socializing with my friends when we're going to a club or we're going out to dinner, to help people unlearn, to make space and give grace for people to unlearn and make mistakes. And then as they're doing that, I'm also unlearning my ableism and learning the correct language and behaviors in order to model that for others.
Keely, go ahead.
So similar to Cara, I also did not grow up with a disability. I actually wanted to be a dancer and was kind of well on my way to having that dream come to reality. I got into a prestigious dance academy in London when I was around 16. And pretty early on into my training, I ended up just feeling unwell. So when I went to the doctors, I was immediately told, "You've just got anxiety, it's an eating disorder, you're just stressed, don't worry about it, you'll be fine." And I wasn't fine. I proceeded to then spend the next 4 years in hospital going through misdiagnosis, a lot of medical malpractice, and came out the other end with a disability, with PTSD, also from the medical trauma that I went through, and also with chronic pain, chronic illness, and a whole host of other fun things that were completely new to me. When I came to the US, which was about 5 years ago, I ended up getting this amazing job within the entertainment industry, and I was trying to find my way back to things that I was passionate about. And then after disclosing my condition and asking for accommodations, I then got told that I could no longer have that job. And that was, I think, probably my first experience really getting to feel like I was a disabled person. The times before that, I had just kind of got on with the comments around, "You look too pretty to be ill," or "You can't sit on this bus, you're in this accessible space on the bus because you are just taking advantage of the system, you don't look disabled." So all of the times before that, I didn't even realize were ableism. And I think the first time that I really experienced that explicit ableism was when I got discriminated against and wasn't able to have that job. And that was definitely a light bulb moment and a wake-up call, but also unfortunately recognizing and hearing from a lot of friends within the community that that is a unfortunately normalized and very common story within the community.
So this session is really structured around designing for inclusion. And anyone who's engaged in a design, anything, knows you start with an understanding of the individual, right? Who are you designing for? And what outcomes are you designing for that individual? And so we really wanted to anchor our discussion in both Cara and Keely's own personal experience, but I also just wanted to briefly share mine, because I think one of the important things about disability that we all have to remember is that you can be temporarily disabled, you can be permanently disabled. You can age into disability, you can be born with a disability. So I've had 2 children. When I was pregnant with my son, my first child, I was living at the time in the state of California, which has a paid leave program that's run by the state of California. And I filed all of my paid leave paperwork with the Office of Disability. And it included questions like, when did your disability begin? Which was a reference to when did I become pregnant? I remember filling out the paperwork and just being insulted by the fact that I was being called quote unquote disabled by the state of California. Fast forward, my son's now 10. I now do this work, and I have come to understand the word disability in such a different way, and now would proudly explain that I was temporarily disabled, meaning my body was doing something different than somebody else's body at that moment, meaning carrying a human. And as a result, there were things that I needed from the government that I lived in. And the way for me to access those benefits and those services was to report to that government body my temporary disability. But at the time, the way that I was reacting, and I told everybody about that, anyone that would listen to me, I was like, could you believe what the state of California did to me? They made me file this disability paperwork, and I was just insulted. And now I really own that all that was me expressing my ableism and not having a sense of understanding that there's absolutely nothing wrong or incorrect or bad or inherently negative about having a disability. It's the social stigma that gets attached to the disability, which is not from the individual. So I did, Cara, want to just ask you to define the medical and social model of disability for everyone, so we all are grounded in that.
Sure. So the idea of the medical model is that the problem is with the individual. And in this scenario, doctors, therapists, they are the experts. And in order for me to live a fulfilled life, a happy life, and make the greatest contribution, not only to my workplace, my family, and society, I must be fixed. I must be treated. I must be cured. And what this does is it excludes alternative choices of how to engage in society. For example, I don't have a choice but to use a wheelchair because I can no longer walk. However, I have friends who are deaf who choose not to use cochlear implants and want their only mode of communication to be sign language, for example. So we have to be very careful with the medical model, particularly in the workplace, because often we will ask for medical evidence in order to provide reasonable accommodation. In the case of the charity model, this will also show up in the workplace, really when we're thinking of recruitment, retention, or promotions, is where we see the person with a disability or anything we do for them as an act of charity, that they are less than, that they need to be helped, that they can't do things on their own. And most often this idea of being a burden is put on. And this perpetuates a lot of ableism within the workplace when people will say things like, oh, well, they're only getting it because, they're the diversity hire. Or, oh, they're getting extra attention by giving Friday afternoons off to go to their medical appointment. And so they're being given a leg up. So this is seen as the charity model, that somehow we don't deserve the accommodations that we're being in, or that we are not the same as everyone else. But in the social model, the issue is not the individual or the fact that they have an impairment. What we focus on is breaking down the barriers, in looking at an equal way to break down the barriers and the equitable way to ensure that people with disabilities, and let me say that this is including everyone from a physical disability, sensory impairment, cognitive impairment, mental health illness, chronic illnesses, also being neurodivergent. It's ensuring that we focus, the work that we do is focusing on dismantling the barriers, whether that might be an inaccessible workspace, whether that might be the inability or not having flexi time. Those are just two examples that we saw were very important, particularly during the pandemic. But when also, one of the challenges to focusing on the social model is that our current legislation in this country is not based on the social model. The ADA is an anti-discrimination piece of legislation. We will celebrate its 34th anniversary this coming Friday, July 26th. So while it is imperative to have policies and programs in place, we need to make a huge shift in those programs and policies, as well as in our workplaces, to focus more on the social model and dismantling barriers, rather than trying to fix people or asking an individual to change, and looking at the cultures in the companies we work at, because the responsibility is on them.
Thanks, Cara. And just, I mentioned I'm at Walmart, and we made an announcement last week that I think is an interesting example of this. So there is an assistive shopping cart called the Caroline's Cart, and it was created by the mother of a young woman who has autism, and it was hard for her daughter to be in the stimulating environment that is a Walmart store, but being able to sit in the cart that she had created, which allows an adult to sit facing the person who's pushing the cart. You guys may have seen images of them. Makes that shopping experience, normalizes that shopping experience for that parent and child, or for that, whomever is coming into the store. So we've had these carts in our stores for quite some time, but the policy against which we furnished a cart in one of our stores was if a shopper asked for it. So we acknowledge that there may be a need for a shopper to have a cart, but we assumed that fewer of them would need it than not. So we didn't provide them in all of our stores. So just last week, we made a change in our policy and are now going to provide 2 carts in every single one of our just shy of 5,000 stores. What that does, what I hope that does, is it sends a message about inclusion in our stores for different shoppers. For shoppers who may perceive a Walmart environment as not being inclusive, now have a different tool to use for that shopping experience to be more inclusive. And so when we talk about designing for inclusion, a lot of it is, rather than waiting and asking and forcing the individual who might need something different than someone else to say, this is what I need, it's how can I immediately provide that, and not think of that as a formal accommodation, but just simply a more inclusive way of doing whatever we're doing. I'm not sure how many of you noticed on the main stage, which was a very large, very echoey room, there were captions on all of the screens. There were not always captions at JFF Horizons Conference, but hats off to JFF. We are improving the accessibility of the experience, and that was something that was provided not just for someone in the audience who may be deaf and needing to read that, but for those of us that were in the very back of the room where you could hardly hear what the speakers were saying. So it created a higher quality experience for everyone, not just folks who might have needed that particular accommodation. So to both of you ladies, I would love to just hear a little bit about what to you it means to design for inclusion, and in your own work, what are some examples of how you've seen that play out? And Keely, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I would love to add to that too. I think that's such a great example with the captions of how oftentimes I think non-disabled people assume what disabled people will or will not show up to, or will or will not apply for, or will or will not do. And I think when we talk about accessibility, we often forget about the attitudinal barriers which also exist within the social model of disability. Because even if we lived in a fully accessible world, whatever that means to you, because what is fully accessible, but even if we did live in that fully accessible world and attitudinal barriers still existed, then ableism is still present. But I think to your question around what does designing for inclusion mean to me, I really think we need to build and create new systems and have new people designing those systems. I have been building my company Making Space, which is a talent acquisition and learning platform for companies to train, access, and retain pre-qualified disabled talent. And our theory of change really exists within what if we provide accessible, free, on-demand, and job-specific education and provide that to disabled people and create this pre-qualified pipeline of talent based on specific roles that are hiring? We think that it will create better outcomes for both the disabled people applying for the roles, but also the companies. They're able to have higher quality hires, increased retention, increased productivity, just this higher quality pool of talent. And also we think that it will get disabled people into higher quality jobs, which is so important. And I think we need to create these new pathways because, as an example, when I moved to LA, it was very obvious pretty early on that the majority of entry-level roles oftentimes prioritized stamina over talent. They would emphasize requirements around having to lift a certain amount of weight or having to drive a car or various other things that I wasn't able to do, which prevented me from getting into the workforce. And other jobs, you needed the relevant experience, those entry-level credits or those entry-level roles on your resume to be able to get into the other positions. So there's this huge barrier to employment. So if we can create new pathways and new systems, then I think we can design for inclusion in much better ways.
Thank you, Keely. Cara?
When I think of designing for inclusion in a nutshell, it is going from compliance to value creation. And in order to see disability inclusion and design, we need to, as such, we need to change our cultures and our mindset. And that's going back to the basics of unlearning what we have been taught about people with disabilities, their value, their place in society. But I also think that we have to think broader above and beyond just culture change, which is often pigeonholed into an HR or DE&I role, and looking at diversifying our efforts, not as a one-off, but a strategic approach with an actual strategy for an organization. And that diversification can stem also into marketing and comms. It can stem into your, obviously, your senior leadership, your operations, your outward-facing and inward-facing work. But I also think of it in terms of supply chains. So I have a client called Global Disability Innovation Hub out of the UK, and I work on raising £100 million to invest in private sector companies that are owned by disabled entrepreneurs and/or are companies that are designing assistive technology. We see a lot of talk around ESG investments where companies are looking at these benchmarks of making sure that companies are focused on environmental standards, social standards, and governance. But now we're seeing a trend where there's also a focus on disability inclusion as being one of the standards that we should be looking at. So I think this diversification of where investment funds are made available is an important part of that discussion of designing for inclusion.
So speaking of that and just the economy at large, and I've messed up my script a bit because I was captivated by what both of you were saying, but going to just the basics of what we see in the U.S. labor market, both on the employment side, Cara, for you, and on the entrepreneurship side, Keely, for you. So Cara, tell us a little bit about like what is the current state of people with disabilities in the U.S. labor force?
So it's quite shocking when we think of the numbers. There's 64 million people with disabilities in the United States. And the statistic that's come out of the CDC is that 1 in 4 working adults have a disability. And so often we only look at an unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is usually at least double for persons with disabilities than for people without disabilities. And the government actually published last year in 2023 that the unemployment rate was 7.2% for persons with disabilities and only 3.5% for people without disabilities. But what captures my attention more and feels more shocking and urgent, and there a need for to be a focus by public and private sector, is the fact that the employment rate for people with disabilities last year in the United States was only 22.5%. Where are the rest of us? Part of that is many of us might be underemployed. There are many of us, like Keely and I, who are self-employed entrepreneurs, and I'll let her talk about the entrepreneurship. But then there are also people like a friend and a mutual acquaintance by the name of Dan, who is a Yale and Harvard educated lawyer who cannot work because he then will not receive Medicaid and the 24-hour assistance he needs as a person who is quadriplegic and needs full-time care. So what we see is that one of the reasons these numbers, while they are atrocious, they're also not representative of the actual situation because we don't have enough data and we don't have enough accurate data.
Keely, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So from the entrepreneur standpoint, so disabled entrepreneurs are 400 times less likely to receive funding than non-disabled entrepreneurs. And I think we're often, as disabled entrepreneurs, expected to run for-profits because of the charity model of disability. And it's usually quite shocking to people when I tell them that my company is for-profit, venture-backed, scalable, not nonprofit, not charity. And it's so important that we also normalize disabled people being experts in subjects beyond just disability. There are so many incredible disabled people who are lawyers, who are entrepreneurs running businesses that has nothing to do with disability. But the interesting thing is the majority of disabled entrepreneurs who employ disabled people or employ people who are underrepresented. We are the biggest employers of disabled people because we recognize and value disabled talent, unlike, unfortunately, the leaders that we've historically had. But we must increase the investment in disabled people. And Diego, actually, who's in this room, runs an amazing accelerator called Together International, specifically focused on getting more investment into the hands of disabled entrepreneurs.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. And, it's interesting. Walmart, as a company for quite some time, has had a very robust supplier inclusion program. And it's only been in the last couple of years that we've started to include DOBIs or disability-owned enterprises within the network of the inclusive supplier work that we do, where we're proactively reaching out to, identifying businesses, and bringing them in to our company. It's also allowed us to provide a set of products and services to our customers that we weren't otherwise able to provide. And so in that sense, there's a tremendous amount of innovation and market opportunity to be captured by that also more inclusive approach. So let's just talk for a little bit, because we are at a workforce conference. I had the pleasure of working for Walmart Foundation for quite some years and funding JFF as an organization, and believe wholeheartedly in the broader aspiration that gathers us all here today, which is addressing barriers around economic opportunity, particularly for those who have been, for whatever reason, historically excluded from aspects of our economy. But I do have to say, I spent 15 years working in that space and never talked about disability. And that's not necessarily something I'm proud of. It's something I'm trying to fix. It's part of why I took the role that I have now. And when I took it, what struck me most is that this community here, as a part of Jobs for the Future, who's looking at the future of work, who's looking at innovation, who's looking at economic inclusion, has, for a variety of reasons, including that it's perceived to be difficult, not been able to capture the opportunity that we're talking about here on stage today. So I want to shift gears a little bit and just hear what opportunities do you guys think are out there for companies to be more inclusive in their hiring and retention practices? But then also, what are tangible things that our audience here today, irrespective of where you sit or what leadership role you hold within your organization, can do to help end disability exclusion in the U.S. workforce?
I think we can start, we need, as an organization, as a company, there needs to be an inward analysis as well as an outward analysis. So first and foremost, we must acknowledge that there are many people with disabilities working inside your organization. You just might not know who they are. And just because maybe you are an organization that's doing well on your disability inclusion path, and you seem to have the right policies in place and budgets for reasonable accommodations, there still are people, because of their own journeys, who choose not to disclose. And so really having an understanding as much as you can of who are they, what do they need, how do they engage, what was their recruitment like, and what is their growth within the organization been like. Having that assessment as a baseline is imperative. The support of the senior executives of your company, the board of directors, the C-suite executives, of them promoting this constantly, not at a one-off once a year for the American with Disabilities Act anniversary, or for only in July for Pride Month, which is our Disability Pride Month, but throughout the year as a way of doing business, not something we do, is imperative. But then also looking at the outside. Are you providing services and products for your disabled consumers? Are you making sure that everything that you put out into the world, like your digital business card, your website, is accessible so that you can really actually be faithful to economic prosperity and make sure that you're maximizing your potential consumer base as well as your potential workforce? But one of the things we also have to think of is that the one constant in our lives and in business is change. And sometimes there will be a break in employment, whether because there's an illness or there's an accident. And we have to couple that with looking at the future of work. And this is something that our colleague Bob Ledke from the Harkin Institute would have talked about. And there is an enormous opportunity to work with the 78 vocational centers around this country that help prepare people who have had maybe a disability, an injury, an illness, prepare to go back to work. But those organizations themselves also need to be focusing on the future of work, the role of AI, the role of assistive technology. We need to transform these discussions, and this is part of the outside work, in how we're preparing for the future.
Thanks, Cara. Keely, go ahead.
I wanted to, everything that Cara said, that was amazing. I wanted to go further into that accommodations piece, self-disclosure, self-ID. I think that is one of the biggest reasons why we don't have more disabled leaders, or at least visible disabled leaders, because we are so prohibited from career advancement, career mobility, because oftentimes we don't have what we need within the workplace, and we're so scared to ask for it because of the fear of discrimination, because of the fear of what disability still means to so many people. And I think one of the great examples of that, also of just not being believed when you need an accommodation, and that constant I'm usually so scared about talking openly about what I need because I'm constantly worried people are going to question it. And I think a good example is around COVID. Disabled people have been fighting for decades to have the accommodation of to work from home, to work remote. And it was only made available when non-disabled people needed it and when there was a global pandemic. So I think that really showcases the deep-seated bias that exists and the lack of disabled leadership.
Thank you, Keely, for that. Yeah. One of the interesting things when we opened and launched the Accessibility Center of Excellence, probably the number one piece of feedback that we received at Walmart was about our accommodations process. And it's not necessarily because we were doing anything wrong. I'll be very careful in how I phrase this. We were actually doing everything to the letter of the law, meaning we were being wildly compliant with, as Cara put, the anti-discrimination legislation that's on the books in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And there's a lot about that protects people in the workplace. But there's a very big difference between having a protection and feeling included. I neglected actually to share my day job with Walmart as I was introducing our illustrious panelists. So I am a senior director in our Office of Belonging. And our Office of Belonging really focuses on the diversity, equity, and inclusion journey of our company. And our goal is to ensure that all of our associates feel seen, supported, and connected. And so when we were looking at the way that we manage and run accommodations, which is, again, all to the letter of the law, run by a division of our compliance organization. There's nothing inherently wrong or incorrect about what they're doing, but it doesn't, by the way it currently functions and by the way it's designed, create a sense of inclusion or a sense of belonging, particularly for our new hires who might need any kind of different setup for their laptops, any kind of different type of equipment. We issue equipment on the first day to everybody and just assume that everybody needs the same thing. So one of the things that we did, and it's a small big thing, is we started creating a few options within the type of equipment that is initially issued. We didn't require any sort of accommodation for it. We just said you can have this or this. You can have this keyboard or this keyboard. You can have this mouse or this mouse. It doesn't capture everybody's needs, but it starts to suggest that perhaps, crazy idea, not everyone needs the exact same thing in order to be their best selves and feel fully included in the workforce. And what that started was a really interesting trend where now we have a number of leaders saying, well, why can't I just offer this? Why do I have to make an associate, we call our employees associates, request this? Why can't I just make that available right out of the gate? And so it's led to this really interesting discussion for our company about the difference between compliance and inclusion. And Cara, you alluded to this, but I want to go into this a little bit more because I think it's so fundamental to the mental model of how we're approaching what it means to to include everyone. And I do want to just mention, because I think it's incredibly powerful, right? And I assume most of you are familiar with the curb cut effect, but in the event that you're not, when it was required that curb cuts, literally, right, as you roll on or off of a curb, or put into sidewalks, it did not just benefit someone who may be in a wheelchair. Benefited me when I was pushing my kid's stroller, benefits me when I travel and I'm pulling a wheeling suitcase, benefits folks who are moving items up and down that ramp. And that initially was a protection for a certain group of folks, but it provides access and opportunity for so many more. And so I think when I think about what we're trying to do at Walmart, we are trying to find more curb cut opportunities for our workforce and for our customers. But again, would love to hear from each of you just around that compliance versus inclusion and what you're seeing in that space. Keely, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's Jim Lebrecht, who was the co-director of Crip Camp, who says this and says it really well, that the ADA and the law is the foundation, not the ceiling. And we have to continuously build beyond compliance. Compliance is just the foundation, and so many people can't even reach that, which is so disappointing. So it's incredible what Walmart are doing, what Cara is doing, because it really should be the norm. We should be continuously striving for better, because it does include everyone. It does make life better for everyone. And I think we see this with oftentimes inclusion initiatives as well. When budgets get cut, when times get hard, they are the first things to go, unfortunately, and they shouldn't be, but they are. So when we build things that are a part of the fundamental business strategy, then they will stay, they will make things better for everyone, and it will just be normalized.
That normalization of not just disclosure, but disability inclusion is what is going to change the game. Whether it's curb cuts, cell phones, speech to text, email, these were all inventions that were made for persons with disabilities, and now I don't know any of us in this room who don't use almost all of those. But I think what's important as well is to remember, as the largest, people say minority group, but I'd like to say identity group in the world of 1.8 billion people. And if you're thinking about a close family member and a friend, we're about 3.5 billion people in the world. And we're talking about the consumer power of about $7 billion. And in the United States, it's about $500 billion, the consumer power of people with disabilities. We can't have a one-size-fits-all solution. The needs, let's say, of an African-American deaf woman who lives in Atlanta, which has the highest maternal mortality rate in the country, who is a single mother of 3 children, one of those children who has autism and is on the spectrum, and she's working 3 jobs but would really like to just work 1 job. Her needs are very different than, say, a white, gay, single, 50-year-old man who works in Silicon Valley, who is disabled but has 8 figures in his bank account. We need to create intersectional lenses in which we approach this work. We're doing it very well in some other areas, but we need to do a better job, because I'm not only a woman with a disability, I'm also South Asian, biracial, a woman with a master's degree who speaks 5 languages, who lives all over the world. FYI, never leaving New York again. But there's so much more to me than just my disability. And there's so much more potential for a company when they're looking at disability inclusion through an intersectional lens, and really importantly, with an equity approach. Your strategy should be who is the most difficult person to reach, who is the most marginalized person in your organization or your consumer base in your supply chain, and design to reach that person. Because when you cast your net that wide, you include everyone, and that's value creation. That's not just compliance.